She signed her name on the divorce papers with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and by the time the ink dried, she had nothing left. No savings, no job, no home, just a chronic heart condition, a borrowed coat, and a man who had spent 3 years building the perfect cage before he burned it down with her still inside. Nathan Cross thought he'd erased Charlotte Whitmore from the world. What he didn't count on was the man who had been searching for her for 7 years, a man the entire East Coast feared to cross. This is the story of what happens when the wrong woman ends up under the protection of the most dangerous man in New York. If this story has you gripping your seat, hit like right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The courthouse smelled like old paper and worse decisions. Charlotte Whitmore sat in the hallway on a wooden bench that had probably absorbed 20 years of other people's misery, and she thought, absurdly, about the coat she was wearing. It wasn't hers. It belonged to her neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, who had pressed it into Charlotte's hands that morning without being asked, the way older women sometimes knew things before you did. The coat was brown wool, slightly too wide in the shoulders, and it smelled faintly of mothballs and something sweeter underneath, like dried lavender. Charlotte focused on that smell because focusing on it meant she didn't have to think about what she'd just done, what she'd just signed. The paralegal had slid the papers across the conference table at 9:47 in the morning with the particular kind of efficiency that people deploy when they want to seem neutral but are actually deeply uncomfortable. Charlotte had not cried. She'd told herself she wouldn't, and she hadn't, and she felt no pride about that because the truth was she had used up everything she had just getting herself into that building. There was nothing left for tears. Nathan hadn't come himself. Of course he hadn't. He'd sent his attorney, a man named Pierce, who wore shoes that cost more than Charlotte's monthly rent, and who never once looked her in the eye. Pierce had explained, in the droning bureaucratic language of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had become texture rather than content, that the joint accounts had already been restructured, that Charlotte's access to the firm's internal systems had been revoked effective that morning, and that any attempt to contest the asset division would result in a prolonged legal process that, given the pending fraud investigation, would likely prove more damaging to her than to his client. Charlotte had said, "What fraud investigation?" Pierce had looked at his watch. That was 3 hours ago. Now she was outside, and the Manhattan air hit her like a fist, cold and diesel-soaked and completely indifferent to the fact that her life had just been disassembled with the clinical precision of a hostile corporate acquisition. She walked because standing still felt dangerous. Like if she stopped moving, her body would finally understand what had happened and simply give out. Her heart had been giving her trouble for the past week, that low stuttering ache behind her sternum that her cardiologist called manageable, in a tone that always made Charlotte suspect he was being generous. She pressed her fingers against her ribs as she walked, an old habit, checking. Bryant Park was half a block west. She ended up there without deciding to go there, drawn by the open space and the bench rows that faced nothing in particular. The lunch crowd had thinned. A few pigeons worked the pavement near the fountain. Charlotte sat down and opened her phone and spent 4 minutes trying to access her bank account before the app finally told her what she already knew. Account access suspended. Contact your financial institution. She put the phone face down on her thigh. She had $43 in her wallet. She had no job. She had approximately 11 days before her sublease ran out on the apartment in Midtown that Nathan had never once visited because it had been her space, the one corner of her life that was genuinely hers, and she had held on to it even after the marriage started going bad because some part of her had known, on some animal level, that she would need an exit. Now even that was going. The fraud investigation, whatever it was, whatever Nathan had constructed, would make it impossible to find another firm willing to take her on. Her professional reputation was the only currency she'd had left, and she could feel it draining in real time. She was 31 years old. She had a degree from Georgetown, 7 years of accounting experience, and $43. "Well," she said quietly to no one. "There it is." She heard them before she saw them. The particular cadence of expensive footsteps, the subtle shift in ambient sound that happens when people nearby become alert. She looked up. The woman walking toward her was probably 24, tall and luminously assembled in the way that took significant money and effort to appear effortless. Charlotte recognized her from the 3 photographs she had found on Nathan's secondary phone 8 months ago, the phone he'd claimed was for work contacts. Jenna something. Jenna Walsh, maybe. or Ward, something that started with a W, which struck Charlotte now as an almost absurd coincidence. Charlotte Whitmore. Not a question. The woman stopped about 3 feet away, tilting her head with the practiced cruelty of someone who had rehearsed this. I've been wanting to do this for months. I just wanted to see your face, now that it's over. Charlotte looked at her. He told me about you, the woman continued. He said you were cold. He said you cared more about spreadsheets than about him. He said, I don't care what he said. The woman blinked. She'd expected something different. Tears, probably, or in anger, the kind that could be photographed and sent to Nathan as proof. I'm just saying, she said, recalibrating, that you should have seen it coming. A man like Nathan doesn't stay with someone who makes him feel like a client. Charlotte's heart did the thing it sometimes did. A stutter, a pause, a brief flutter of wrongness that lasted half a second and left a thin sweat on her palms. She pressed her fingers against her ribs again. Are you finished? I just think you should know that he's happy, that I heard you. Charlotte stood, which was harder than it should have been. The world tilted very slightly. She breathed through it. You came here to feel something. I'm not going to give it to you. Have a good afternoon. She took 3 steps, and then the world did something dramatic and unannounced. It lurched sideways. Or she did, or both. And the next thing Charlotte knew, she was sitting on the pavement with her back against the bench leg and her palms scraped against the concrete and her heart doing something she could only describe as alarming. Not pain, not exactly. More like a sudden structural uncertainty, the way a building sounds when something in its frame shifts. She sat there and breathed slowly, counting, the way the cardiologist had taught her. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. The cold from the concrete was coming through Mrs. Delgado's coat. The woman, Jenna, whatever, had already walked away, either disgusted or frightened, and Charlotte couldn't decide which was worse. A shadow fell across her. She looked up expecting a stranger with a phone already dialing 911, or worse, just staring. But the man standing over her was neither taking out a phone nor staring. He was simply standing, very still, with his hands at his sides, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity, not alarm. Something more considered than either. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of physical presence that doesn't come from size alone, but from something in the way a person occupies space. Dark coat, charcoal suit beneath it, the understated quality of clothes that were extraordinarily expensive precisely because they didn't announce it. Late 30s, maybe 40, with a face that had seen weather and hadn't softened for it. Dark eyes that were taking in everything about her with a calm, measuring attention that made her feel, bizarrely, more observed than she'd felt in years. I'm fine, she said. You're on the ground, he said. His voice was low and unhurried with the slight texture of a man who was accustomed to not raising it. I'm aware of that. Do you need a doctor? She stopped. What she needed was a list so long and so catastrophic that giving it to a stranger on the pavement in Bryant Park seemed clinically insane. I'm having a cardiovascular episode. Minor, I know what it is, I just need a minute. He crouched down, which surprised her. Not in a hovering way, but in a way that put him at her level, forearms resting on his knees like he was prepared to wait as long as she needed. Up close, the quality of his stillness was even more pronounced. Most people couldn't sit that quietly. Charlotte had met almost none who could. Charlotte Whitmore, he said. She looked at him sharply. I've been looking for you, he said, for about 7 years, which makes this... He glanced at the pavement, at her scraped palm, at the slight gray tint she could feel in her own face. A worse introduction than I'd planned. Her heart did something else now, and it wasn't the arrhythmia. It was the simpler, older fear of a woman alone who has just been told a stranger knows her name. Who are you? Damian Blackwood. She didn't know the name, not immediately. And then something moved in her memory, a fragment from a long time ago, a conversation she'd overheard as a child between her father and a man whose name she'd been too young to retain, a conversation that had stopped abruptly when her father noticed her in the doorway. She'd asked about it once, years later, and her father had said only, some debts aren't about money, Charlotte. They're about something that doesn't have a name. That name is supposed to mean something to me, she said. Your father's name was Richard Whitmore, Damien said. He died 4 years ago. Cardiac failure, same as what you have. He never told you what he did for my family in 2009 because he wasn't that kind of man. But I know. And I've been trying to repay it for the past 7 years, except every time I tried to reach you, the access got cut off. Emails that bounced, phone numbers that had been changed, a forwarding address that went nowhere. Charlotte was very still. Nathan, that would be my guess, Damien said, though I'm still working on confirming the specifics. The sound of footsteps, multiple, deliberate, the kind of cadence that comes from people who are used to moving through spaces with authority, made her turn her head. 3 men in dark suits were crossing the park toward them. Not police. Corporate security. She could tell by the way they wore their earpieces like accessories rather than equipment, and by the particular swagger of men who believed their employer's money made them untouchable. The one in front was built like a man who had once been genuinely formidable and now relied on that former reputation. He stopped about 6 feet away, looked at Charlotte, and said, "Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Cross requires your immediate presence for questioning in relation to the internal audit. You'll need to come with us." "She's not going anywhere," Damien said. He hadn't stood up. He was still crouching at Charlotte's level, which made the words carry a quality of absolute stillness that was somehow more unsettling than if he'd risen to his full height. He said it the way a person states a geographical fact. The lead guard looked at him for the first time, and something shifted in the man's face. A recalibration, a brief but visible reassessment. "Sir, this is a private—" "I know what it is." Damien stood then, and the full height of him had an effect on the space between them that Charlotte could feel from 3 feet away. "And I know who sent you, which means you already know that this conversation is over." He looked at the guard with the particular expression of a man who has never in his adult life been uncertain about whether the room would move in his direction. "Go back to wherever Nathan Cross is waiting and tell him that Charlotte Whitmore is no longer available." The guard held his ground for exactly 4 seconds. Charlotte counted. Then the 3 of them withdrew. Not running, too professional for that, but with a speed that made the retreat unmistakable. She was still on the ground. Damien turned back to her and extended one hand, palm up, a simple and unornamented offer. "I have a place 2 blocks from here," he said. "Medical staff on site. You can leave whenever you want. You don't owe me anything, and I'm not going to pretend you do." Charlotte looked at his hand. She thought about the $43 in her wallet. She thought about Pierce checking his watch. She thought about Jenna Walsh, or Ward walking away without looking back. She thought about her father saying some debts aren't about money, and about the way he used to look at her sometimes with an expression she had never been able to fully decode, like he was holding something back that he hoped he'd eventually be able to give her. She took Damien's hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her palm was still scraped. Her heart was still misbehaving. Mrs. Delgado's coat was damp from the pavement, but when she stood, the world stayed level this time, and she noted that as a minor fact of possible significance. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Go ahead." "I'm not in the habit of trusting strangers." "You shouldn't be," he said. He wasn't smiling. He was simply watching her with that same level attention. "I'll earn it or I won't. But right now you need a doctor and somewhere safe to sit down, and I have both. Everything else can wait." She studied his face. There was something there that she couldn't manufacture a reason to distrust, and she was usually good at finding reasons. She had spent 3 years being systematically taught not to trust her own instincts, which meant she was only now, standing on cold pavement outside Bryant Park, beginning to wonder if those instincts might still work. "All right," she said. They walked west on 42nd Street, Damien keeping pace with her slow, careful steps without once suggesting she should move faster. And behind them the park returned to its pigeons and its lunchtime quiet, as though nothing had happened there at all. The building was on a side street off 6th, not the kind of address that announced itself, which Charlotte suspected was deliberate. The lobby was minimal and almost aggressively unmarked, staffed by 2 men who were dressed like concierge but held themselves like something else entirely. They acknowledged Damien with nods that were something between deference and professional respect, and held the elevator without being asked. The penthouse was on the 34th floor, and it was, Charlotte thought, the home of someone who had been very wealthy for a very long time and had stopped needing to prove it. Good furniture chosen for durability, not display. Large windows facing downtown and north, the city laid out below with the particular indifference of something too large to care about individual suffering. Books on actual shelves. A kitchen that had been used. The only artwork was a single large format photograph of a coastline she didn't recognize, black and white, mounted without a frame. A woman in her 50s with the crisp manner of a nurse who had worked high-stress environments met them at the door. She didn't look at Damien. She looked at Charlotte, at her pallor and her posture and the way she was holding her ribs, and said, "Sit down," with the authority of someone for whom instructions are not requests. Charlotte sat. The next 40 minutes were the first quiet 40 minutes she'd had in what felt like weeks. The nurse, whose name was Ellen, delivered without preamble, checked Charlotte's pulse and blood pressure, asked 3 direct questions about her medication and her last cardiology appointment, and told her that she wasn't in crisis, but that she needed to eat something and rest and not do whatever she'd been doing. Charlotte almost laughed at that last part. Damien had withdrawn to the far side of the room during the examination. He stood at one of the windows with his back to her, on the phone with someone in a conversation conducted entirely in short, flat sentences that gave nothing away. When Ellen finished and left, he came back and sat across from Charlotte in one of the chairs with a directness that she was beginning to recognize as simply his natural mode of occupying space. "You didn't know," he said. It wasn't a question. "About what your family owes mine or about what Nathan did?" "Either." "No?" She looked at her hands in her lap. The scrape on her palm had been cleaned and covered. "My father he didn't talk about his business in front of me. I knew he'd worked in finance before I was born. I knew something had happened in 2008, 2009 during the crash. There were years where money was tight, and then suddenly it wasn't, and he never explained the transition. I thought it was just..." She shrugged. "The market. People recovered." "Your father saved my family's entire asset base during the 2009 collapse," Damien said. "He had access to documentation that would have destroyed us, information that our competitors would have paid tens of millions to acquire. He had every financial incentive to use it. He didn't. He buried it, restructured the accounts at significant personal cost, and never asked for anything in return." "That sounds like him," Charlotte said quietly. "I tried to track him down to repay the debt properly after the fact. By then he'd moved. When he died, I started looking for you instead." Something moved briefly in Damien's expression. Not sentiment, but something adjacent to it. "Your ex-husband's firm had a contract with one of my smaller holdings. I suspect he became aware that I was looking for you and spent considerable effort making sure I couldn't find you. I'm still building out the timeline." Charlotte absorbed this. "He knew about my father's relationship with you." "That's my working assumption. And he knew that my father's stake in his company..." She stopped. A piece of it arrived all at once, the way patterns sometimes do, not gradually, but as a completed image you somehow hadn't seen before. "The equity stake. My father's investment in the company, the one Nathan took over. That's not incidental, is it? That's the whole thing." Damien watched her work through it. "He didn't marry me because of me," she said, and her voice was very flat and very controlled because the alternative was letting it become something she couldn't manage in front of a stranger. "He married me to get control of my father's legacy stake before I understood what it was worth. We don't have complete confirmation yet. My legal team started working on it 2 hours ago." "But that's what you think." "Yes." Charlotte sat with that for a moment. Outside, the city continued its enormous indifference. 43 floors below, people moved along 42nd Street with their coffee and their earbuds, and their complete ignorance of the fact that a woman was sitting in a penthouse having the last illusion of her marriage finally and clinically dissected. 3 years. She'd given 3 years of her life to a man who had selected her the way you select a tool for a specific job, who had kept her close enough to prevent her from accidentally discovering her own inheritance, who had systematically dismantled her career and her confidence and her savings as insurance against her ever becoming strong enough to threaten him. The thing she felt was not quite grief and not quite rage. It was something colder and more specific. The particular feeling of a person who has been precisely deceived and who is only now calculating the full dimensions of the architecture they have been living inside. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Nothing. I told you that. People in your position always need something." Damien looked at her steadily. "Your father needed nothing from me when he made his choice. I'm trying to honor that. If I do need something from you at some point, I'll tell you directly. I don't do business through obligation." She studied him again, the way she'd studied him in the park. There was a quality to him that she kept bumping up against and couldn't resolve. A man who clearly operated in a world where power was currency and violence was a standing option, and yet who sat across from her speaking with a precision and a restraint that made her feel absurdly like she was the one being handled with care. "I need to know what you are," she said. "Not just the business empire. The rest of it." Damien didn't hesitate. "I run the Blackwood Syndicate. We have significant influence over the East Coast's underground economy. I don't apologize for what I am, and I won't lie about it to make you comfortable." The silence that followed was the kind that required something in return. "Okay," Charlotte said. "Okay? I've spent 3 years married to a man who laundered money through shell companies and framed me for it, and I didn't know. At least you're being direct." She looked at him. "I'd like to see Nathan's financial records. All of them. Whatever your people have already started pulling." Something shifted in Damien's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recognition. The look of a man who has just received slightly more than he anticipated. "I'll have them ready in an hour. And I'd like to be the one to build the case. I'm an accountant. If Nathan falsified records and forged ownership documents, I'll find it faster than your lawyers will." "You just came off a cardiac event." "I've been having cardiac events since I was 26. I've also been doing forensic accounting since I was 23. She met his eyes. "I'm not a victim waiting to be rescued, Mr. Blackwood. I'm a professional who's been temporarily dispossessed. There's a difference." The thing in his expression settled into something that might, on a different face, have been the beginning of a smile. "There is," he agreed. The financial records arrived in 80 minutes, which meant his people had started before he'd made the request. They'd been ahead of the conversation, which told Charlotte something about how Damien Blackwood operated that she filed away for later consideration. She sat at the long table in the penthouse's secondary room with a laptop and 3 external drives and a legal pad, and she worked the way she always worked, which was methodically and without sentiment, because numbers were honest in a way that people consistently failed to be. The first thing she found was small: a discrepancy in a 2021 quarterly filing, a rounding error that was too consistent to be accidental. The kind of thing that a standard audit might have overlooked, but that a forensic accountant recognized as the fingerprint of a system. Someone had been skimming fractions of cents from transaction fees across thousands of accounts, aggregating them into a holding structure that appeared on paper to be a charitable trust. The second thing she found was larger. The company, Cross Capital Management, had been partially capitalized in 2018 using an equity contribution that, when she traced it back through 3 layers of holding companies, originated from a source designated in the original incorporation documents as Whitmore Family Trust Dissolved. A trust she had never been told existed. A trust that contained, according to the valuation at the time of its supposed dissolution, approximately $6 million in assets. A trust that bore her father's name and, as the beneficiary line, her own. Charlotte sat back in her chair. She put her pen down on the legal pad. She stared at the screen. She was aware of her heartbeat. Steady now, not alarming, just present in the way it always was when she was at the threshold of something that couldn't be walked back from. She picked the pen back up. She kept working. It was past midnight when Damien appeared in the doorway with 2 coffees. He'd shed the suit jacket somewhere in the past few hours. The effect was not casual, so much as slightly more visible, like a reduction in surface distance. He set 1 cup down near her without interrupting her line of sight. "What did you find?" he asked. "Everything," she said. The word came out flat and total. "It's all here. The trust, the equity theft, the fraud structure he used to cover the ownership transfer. He's been laundering my father's money through his own company for 8 years. She looked at the screen, and 3 months ago, when he realized I was starting to ask questions about the finances, I had asked about some inconsistencies in our joint tax filing. Nothing specific, just a question. He started building the framework to frame me. Transferred funds from accounts I had signatory access to, created a trail of transactions in my name, then triggered the audit. He preempted you. He was afraid I'd find it accidentally." She finally looked up. He wasn't wrong to be afraid. Damien looked at the screen, at the legal pad covered in her notations, at her scraped palm wrapped around the coffee cup. "You've been working for 6 hours." "I'm aware." "You told me you weren't a victim waiting to be rescued." "I'm not." "No," he said quietly. "You're not." She drank the coffee. It was black and hot, and exactly the right temperature, And she noted this and thought about what it meant that a man who operated at his level of power paid enough attention to detail to get that right. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask? When this is over, when the evidence is complete and Nathan's been dealt with, what happens? To you, to me, to whatever this is." She gestured at the room, at the two of them, at the situation in its entirety. "I need to know what framework I'm operating inside." Damien considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm not in the business of making promises about the future," he said. "What I can tell you is that I won't use you. I won't let you be used, and I won't disappear once this is convenient to forget. That's not a framework. That's a character reference. It's what I have right now." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the screen. "I need another 3 hours," she said. "Then I'll have something you can take to a lawyer." "I'll be here." He left the doorway. She heard him settle into the main room. A chair, the soft sound of something being poured, the particular silence of a man who was accustomed to long waiting. She worked. The city ground forward outside the windows. Somewhere downtown, in a brownstone she'd never been invited to see, Nathan Cross was likely awake, calculating his next move, certain that the woman he'd carefully reduced to nothing was finished. He had miscalculated. People who spend years making someone small tend to forget what that person was before the reduction started. They mistake the result for the original. Charlotte's father had been a quiet man who kept his own counsel and repaid his debts in full and expected nothing back for it. She was starting to understand that this was not weakness. It was a specific kind of strength that required no audience and no acknowledgement, that simply accumulated, patient and invisible, until the moment came when it mattered. She highlighted a cell reference on the screen and wrote the account number on the legal pad in clean, deliberate digits. She was going to take everything Nathan had built from the ruins of her father's trust, and she was going to do it not with rage but with precision, which was worse, the kind of thing you couldn't charm your way out of or reframe as a misunderstanding, because it would simply be true, documented, and irrefutable. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. Unknown number. She almost let it go. She answered. A woman's voice, whispering, with a fear in it that Charlotte recognized because she had lived inside that particular frequency for 3 years. "Charlotte Whitmore?" "Don't say anything yet, just listen. My name is Olivia Parker. I've been with Nathan for the past 8 months. He doesn't know I'm calling." A pause, the sound of a door closing softly, somewhere on the other end. "He has a server, a private server, separate from everything the firm knows about. I have a copy of it on a flash drive. There are recordings on it, Charlotte, conversations, evidence that goes beyond the financial records, evidence that—" Another pause, longer, something shifting in the sound quality. "Evidence that connects him to things that are a lot worse than fraud." Charlotte's hand tightened on the phone. "There's something on there about your father," Olivia Parker whispered. "Something about how your father died." The city went very quiet outside the window. Charlotte's heart, for the second time that day, did something that required her full attention. "Where are you?" she said. Olivia Parker talked for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Charlotte counted because counting was something to do with her hands, while the rest of her went very still, the way she'd learned to go still as a child when her father was having one of his quiet evenings, when the weight in the house was the kind you didn't disturb with unnecessary motion. Olivia's voice stayed low and compressed throughout, the voice of someone who had been practicing smallness for months, condensing herself to take up less space, less air, less of whatever Nathan Cross had decided she was allowed to occupy. When Olivia finished, Charlotte said, "Are you safe right now?" "I'm in the bathroom of his Midtown office. He thinks I'm at dinner with a client." "How long do you have?" "Maybe 20 minutes before someone notices." "The flash drive, where is it?" "My apartment. Hidden. He doesn't know I made a copy. I don't think he knows. He's very careful, Charlotte. He runs security scans on all the devices in his orbit, so I used a machine he's never seen, a laptop I bought cash from a pawn shop in Queens 3 weeks ago. The drive is encrypted, but I have the password." Charlotte wrote the address Olivia gave her on the corner of the legal pad. Midtown East. A building she knew. She'd walked past it 100 times in the years when her life had still seemed like something she was constructing rather than something being systematically taken apart. "I'll send someone tonight." "Not the police?" "No, not the police." A pause on Olivia's end. The particular pause of a person deciding whether to say the next thing. You said you'd send someone. Who are you with? Charlotte looked at the wall between herself and the main room, where the particular silence of Damien Blackwood continued to occupy the apartment like a presence with mass and temperature. Someone who can help. Nathan has people everywhere. He has a detective on retainer, someone in the DA's office he went to school with, contacts in two of the major media outlets. If word gets out before the evidence is secured, I understand. Charlotte. Olivia's voice shifted, lost the informational cadence, and became something raw underneath, something that had been waiting. The recordings on that drive, the conversations about your father. I listened to about 20 seconds of one before I stopped because I didn't want to know more than I needed to know. But what I heard, she stopped, started again. Just be ready. Whatever you think happened to him, be ready for it to be something else. Charlotte's pen went still on the legal pad. Get out of that bathroom, she said. Go somewhere public. Don't go back to Nathan's apartment tonight. Don't contact me from your regular phone again. Okay? Olivia. Yeah. You did the right thing. The line went dead. Charlotte sat for a moment with the phone face down on the table and her hand flat on top of it, pressing it into the surface like she could push what she'd just heard back down through the wood and away from herself, just for a few more minutes, just long enough to finish processing what she already had. Her father's face arrived without permission. The particular version of it from the last time she'd seen him, 2 weeks before the cardiac event that killed him, when he'd looked tired in a way she'd attributed to age and had not questioned because she'd had other things on her mind that week, things that now seemed almost incomprehensibly small. She stood up, went to the doorway. Damien was in the main room at the kitchen counter with a glass of water, reading something on his phone with the compressed attention of a man moving through material quickly. He looked up when she appeared. I need you to send someone to an address in Midtown East, Charlotte said. Tonight. There's a flash drive in a third-floor apartment. I have the location, the hiding place, the encryption password. It needs to be retrieved before Nathan figures out it exists. Damien set his phone down. Who contacted you? A woman named Olivia Parker. She's been with Nathan for the past 8 months. She says the drive contains recordings, private conversations, things beyond the financial records. Charlotte paused. She said there's something on it about my father. The quality of Damien's attention shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible at distance, but Charlotte was close enough to see it. A slight recalibration in the stillness, a fractional tightening around the eyes. About how he died, she said. Damien looked at her for a moment longer than the previous moments had required. Then he took out a second phone, not the one he'd been reading from, and made a call. 3 sentences, an address, a description, a time. The call lasted under 45 seconds. He put the phone away. Marcus will be there in 15 minutes, he said. Can he be trusted? With my life. Regularly. Charlotte nodded. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, not defensively but structurally, like she needed the pressure to hold herself at the right dimensions. You knew my father better than you've told me. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, delivered with the flat precision she'd learned to use when she needed information and didn't want the emotional charge of the question to give the other person an exit. Damien picked up his water glass, looked at it, set it back down. I knew of him. We met twice, once in 2009 when he made the decision about the documents, and once in 2014 when he reached out to tell me that the financial environment had shifted and there were people moving to reopen the questions he'd buried. He warned me. He didn't have to. He did it anyway. 2014. Charlotte did the math. That was when my father sold his equity position in the precursor company to Cross Capital. He told me it was a routine divestment. She looked at the wall. He was liquidating the stake to keep it out of Nathan's reach. Or trying to. If Nathan had already begun building his ownership structure around the Whitmore family trust, then it was already too late. She pressed her fingers against her ribs. Not the arrhythmia this time, just a habit, a way of locating herself. He knew he was in danger. Charlotte, I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm working through it out loud. She met Damien's eyes. I'm going to need everything you have on the timeline between 2014 and my father's death. Not just financials. Everything. I'll have it pulled. Tonight. Tonight, he agreed. She went back to the table. She worked another 2 hours, adding the new vectors to the structure she was building. Not just the financial fraud, but the pattern beneath it. The deliberate geographic isolation of assets. The manufactured paper trail designed to make legitimate inheritance look like criminal transfer. It was elegant in the way that predatory systems often are. Elegant in the same way a trap is elegant. Efficient, minimalist, entirely designed around one purpose. At 2 a.m, Marcus returned. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in the corridor. A brief exchange with Damien that was too low to parse. And then Damien appeared in the doorway with a small encrypted flash drive in his hand. He held it out to her. "Olivia hidden it well," he said. Marcus said the apartment showed signs of a recent search. Drawers not fully closed, a rug shifted. Nathan may have already sent someone. But they didn't find it. No. Charlotte took the drive. It was small and ordinary looking, the kind you'd buy in a pack of 5 from an electronics store, completely unremarkable. She turned it over in her palm. "I want to be the one to open it," she said. "It's your call." The password is my father's first company. All caps, no spaces. The year it was founded at the end. She said it as she typed it, and the drive's encryption interface accepted it on the first try. The directory opened. 47 files, mostly audio recordings, with dates and a brief alphanumeric identifier for each. A handful of document scans. One video file that she noted and moved past for now. She sorted by date and started at the beginning. The first recording was from 2019. Nathan's voice, recognizable even at this distance and through the compression of a covert recording, the particular cadence of it, the half-second before certain words where he constructed the presentation of them. He was speaking to someone whose voice she didn't recognize, a man with a flat transactional affect that suggested someone accustomed to being on the administrative end of decisions rather than the deliberative one. They were discussing the Whitmore Trust dissolution. Specifically, they were discussing how to backdate the dissolution documents so that the equity transfer appeared to predate Richard Whitmore's last will and testament by 11 months. Charlotte listened to 40 seconds of this and then hit pause. She sat with the silence in the room. The city outside had gone to the reduced register of post 2 a.m. Fewer sirens, more distance between sounds, the base register of the garbage trucks that moved through Manhattan in the dark. Her father had died believing his estate was in order. He had made provisions, careful ones, because he was a careful man, and those provisions had been systematically dismantled before his body was in the ground. Maybe before. Maybe while he was still alive and declining, when he wouldn't have had the energy or the clarity to recheck everything, to verify that the documents he'd signed were the documents that had been filed. She scrolled forward in the directory, found a file dated 4 months before her father's death. Opened it. Nathan's voice again. Different quality to this one, tighter, with the particular compression of a man managing something that was close to getting out of control. The second voice on this recording was the one that stopped her breathing for a moment. She'd heard it before. She would know it anywhere. Her father's cardiologist, a man named Reeves, who had treated Richard Whitmore for 6 years, who had been at the funeral, who had shaken Charlotte's hand and told her that Richard had fought it as long as anyone could reasonably expect. She didn't listen long enough to hear specifics. She stopped the recording at the 14-second mark and sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed in through her nose the way the cardiologist, her own, not her father's, had taught her when she needed to bring her heart rate down from the edge of something it couldn't sustain. In, 4 counts. Hold, 4 counts. Out, 6. She did it twice. Then she picked up the phone and called Damien. He appeared in the doorway in under 10 seconds, which meant he'd been close. He looked at her face and didn't say anything, which she was grateful for. "I need you to find out everything about a Dr. Gerald Reeves," she said. Her voice was very steady. "He was my father's cardiologist. He's on this recording." She paused. "With Nathan." Damien looked at the screen, at the open directory, at Charlotte's face, which she was holding very deliberately neutral because the alternative was something she wasn't prepared to do in front of anyone, and possibly not alone either. Not yet. "Give me an hour," he said. "I'll be here." He was gone. She kept working. She didn't open the Reeves recording again. She filed it in a separate folder and labeled it and set it to the side with the precision of someone who knows that certain things need to be accessed only when you are prepared for what they contain, and she was not prepared yet. And that was not weakness, but sequencing. She would get there. She would get through all of it. At 3:15 in the morning, Damien came back with a tablet and set it in front of her. Gerald Reeves, MD, board-certified cardiologist. Private practice on the Upper East Side. Also, as of 2016, a minority stakeholder in a pharmaceutical distribution company that was itself a subsidiary of, she followed the holding structure 3 layers down, Cross Capital Management. Nathan had owned her father's doctor. He had him on the payroll, Charlotte said. Not surprise in her voice. Something beyond surprise. Something that had already metabolized the shock and come out the other side into a kind of hard, flat clarity. It looks that way. We're still pulling the specifics. He didn't just steal from my father. He managed his decline. She looked at the tablet. He made sure it went in one direction. Damien sat down across from her for the first time since she'd started working. He didn't offer anything. No reassurance, no tactical pivot. He simply sat with her in it, which was what she needed, and she registered that he seemed to understand the difference. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to destroy him," she said. "Completely, publicly, in a way that leaves no room for settlements or managed narratives or PR firms spinning the story. I want every person who enabled this to stand in front of it and have their name attached to it." She looked at Damien. "Can you make that happen?" "I can get you the conditions to make it happen. The rest is yours. That's all I need." She turned back to the screen. Dawn was beginning its gray and colorless entry into the city when Damien's second phone rang. He answered it, listened for 30 seconds, and came to the doorway of the workroom with a look that she was beginning to be able to read, the one that meant the situation had changed. "Nathan filed a formal complaint with the DA's office at midnight," he said. "He's accelerating the fraud allegation timeline. The documentation he submitted named you as the primary executor of an illegal transfer scheme dating back to 2018. He's requesting an emergency asset freeze." Charlotte looked up from the screen. "He knows something shifted," she said. "He doesn't know what, but he felt the ground move. My attorney has already filed a response, but if the freeze goes through before we can present the counter evidence, it won't matter," Charlotte said, "because we're not going to wait for a legal process." She closed the laptop and looked at Damien with the particular expression of a woman who has spent the last 8 hours converting grief into precision. "There's a gala. Evelyn Hartford. My father knew her. They were in the same investment circles for 20 years. She was at his funeral. I need you to get me into that room." Damien was quiet for a moment. "The Hartford Gala is the biggest financial gathering in the city. Nathan will be there." "I know. You understand what you're asking." "I'm asking for a room full of people who have the collective institutional weight to make Nathan's position untenable the moment the evidence is presented in front of them. I'm asking for a venue where the documentation can't be suppressed, buried, or reframed, because there will be too many witnesses with too many independent interests to let it disappear." She held Damien's gaze. "I'm not running from him anymore. I'm done with that." Something in Damien's expression settled, that same quality she'd noticed the night before. The recognition of something exceeding expectation. "I have a standing invitation," he said. "Of course you do. You'll need to be visible, at my side. Nathan will see you the moment you walk in." "Good," Charlotte said. "I want him to." She turned back to the table and began organizing the evidence into a presentable structure, sorting the audio files and the financial documents and the ownership records into a sequence that told the story clearly enough that a room full of investors would understand it in real time. Her hands were steady. Her heart was behaving. Outside, the first full light of morning was arriving over Manhattan with its usual complete indifference to the things that had happened in the dark. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, different from Olivia's. One line, no greeting, no signature. "I know what you found. Stop now, and this ends quietly. Push further, and everyone you've let help you pays the price before you do." Charlotte read it once, set the phone face down on the table, picked up her pen. She wrote the phone number on the legal pad, underlined it twice, and turned back to the evidence. The threat sat on the table face down, and Charlotte did not look at it again. That was a choice, and she was aware of making it. The deliberate act of not giving a thing more space than it had already taken. Nathan had sent it to make her stop moving, and the only answer to that was to keep moving, faster, with more precision, until the momentum was irreversible. She understood this the way you understand things that have been true for a long time, but that you've only just named. She worked until 6 in the morning, and then she stopped because her hands were beginning to make errors, transposing digits, losing her place in account strings she'd already verified twice, and errors at this stage were more dangerous than the hour lost to sleep. She lay down on the couch in the secondary room without taking off her shoes and was unconscious in under 4 minutes, which was something her body had learned to do in the years of the marriage when sleep came in fragments and had to be seized rather than courted. She woke at 9 to voices. Not raised voices. Nothing so simple. The particular register of two people having a controlled disagreement, each one holding their volume down by effort, which made the tension in the sound more present rather than less. She sat up. Her back ached from the couch. She oriented herself in the room, the laptop, the legal pad, the flash drive still in the port, and then she followed the sound to the main room doorway. Damien was standing near the windows. Across from him, with the particular posture of a man who had arrived with an agenda and found the terrain less cooperative than expected, stood someone Charlotte hadn't seen before. Late 50s, silver-haired, compact in the way of men who had once been athletic and still carried the architecture of it in their shoulders. He wore a good suit and an expression of concentrated dissatisfaction. He saw Charlotte in the doorway, and the dissatisfaction shifted into something more complicated. "This is her," he said. Not to Charlotte, to Damien. "Charlotte Whitmore," Damien said. His voice was level. Whatever had been happening before she walked in, he was not going to let it continue in front of her. "This is Victor Crane. He's been with the syndicate for 11 years. He manages the legal and financial interface between our operations and the legitimate holding structures." Victor Crane looked at Charlotte the way accountants sometimes looked at a set of books they suspected had been falsified. Not with hostility exactly, but with a professional skepticism that was its own form of aggression. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've been advising Damien that the current course of action presents significant exposure for the syndicate's legitimate interests." "Victor," Damien said, "she needs to hear it." Crane turned back to Charlotte without breaking stride. "Nathan Cross filed the fraud allegation with the DA's office last night. What you may not know is that the filing named not only you, but referenced several financial transactions that passed through holding structures connected to Blackwood Enterprises. Legitimately connected. These are clean accounts, properly documented. But the optics of the syndicate appearing in a federal fraud investigation at this moment, with the current regulatory environment, are complicated," Charlotte said. "Are catastrophic," Crane said. "What Damien is proposing shall taking you to the Hartford Gala, making your presence public, staging a confrontation with Cross in front of half the financial establishment of New York, will draw a level of scrutiny to this organization that we have spent years carefully avoiding." Charlotte looked at Damien. Damien was looking at Crane with the still measuring expression of a man who had already made his decision and was waiting for the argument to exhaust itself. "Victor," she said. Crane turned. "I understand what you're describing. And I'm going to tell you what I have because you should know the scope of it before you finish making your case." She crossed to the table, turned the laptop to face him, and walked him through it in 7 minutes. The trust dissolution, the backdated documents, the equity transfer, the Reeves recording, the pharmaceutical subsidiary. She watched his face as she talked. The skepticism didn't disappear, but it changed character, became less dismissive and more calculating. The look of a man reassessing the weight distribution of a problem. When she finished, Crane was quiet for a moment. "The Reeves connection," he said. "You have audio. 14 seconds of it, enough to establish the relationship and the nature of the conversation. We haven't processed the full file yet." Crane looked at Damien. "If the Reeves material is what she's suggesting—" "It is," Damien said. "Then Cross is not just a civil matter. He's a criminal exposure walking around in a suit waiting to detonate." Crane pinched the bridge of his nose. "Which makes containing him more urgent, not less." A pause. "I still think the gala is an unnecessary risk." "Noted," Damien said, in a tone that meant the conversation was over. Crane gathered himself, the small controlled motions of a man standing down from a position without capitulating entirely, and turned to Charlotte one more time. "The evidence needs to be airtight, not good enough to convince a room full of investors. Airtight enough to withstand a federal defense team with unlimited resources and a client who has spent 20 years cultivating relationships in the legal system." "I know that," Charlotte said. "Do you?" "I'm a forensic accountant, Mr. Crane. I know exactly what airtight looks like because I've spent the last 12 hours building it." She met his eyes. "Nathan is good at covering his tracks on the surface, But he made a fundamental error in 2018 when he structured the trust dissolution, and that error propagates forward through every document he's touched since then. It's not one piece of evidence. It's a chain. Pull any link and the whole structure comes visible. Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. I'll have the syndicate's legal team on standby for the gala. He said it to Damien, but he was looking at Charlotte. For containment purposes. He left. Charlotte turned back to the laptop. He's not wrong about the risk, she said. No, Damien said. He's not. But he's also not right about the alternative. Which is? There isn't one. Cross is accelerating. Every day we wait, he's building more layers into the fraud allegation against you. If we don't move first and move publicly, he controls the narrative. And once he controls the narrative, the evidence becomes a counterclaim rather than an exposure. It becomes your word against his. He came to stand near the table, looking at the screen. The gala is in 4 days. Evelyn Hartford confirmed the invitation this morning. Charlotte looked up. You already called her. Last night, before you went to sleep. She knew your father well. When I explained the situation, he paused with the slight compression of a man choosing words with care. She understood why the timing mattered. What exactly did you tell her? That Richard Whitmore's daughter needed a room and an audience, and that it was time for a debt to be repaid. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Her father's name and Damien's voice still arrived with a slight displacement. The collision of two parts of her life that had existed in separate chambers and were only now being forced into the same space. Okay, she said. 4 days. She spent 2 of those days working and one of them in a cardiologist's office. Not her regular cardiologist, but one of Damien's medical staff. A man named Torres who ran her through a full workup with the thoroughness of someone who had been told the patient's schedule did not allow for a second appointment. Torres adjusted her medication, gave her a look that carried the specific weight of a doctor who disapproves of the circumstances but recognizes they are not his to manage, and told her she was stable enough for whatever she was planning, which she took as the qualified clearance it was meant to be. The 3rd day, in the early afternoon, Olivia Parker called, not from the unknown number, from a new number, different area code, 718, which meant she'd followed Charlotte's instructions and acquired a new phone. Charlotte answered on the 2nd ring. He knows I took the drive, Olivia said. No preamble. The fear from the bathroom 3 nights ago had hardened into something more functional, still present but organized now, working for her instead of against her. I came back to the apartment this morning to get more of my things, and he was there. He didn't say it directly. He never says anything directly. But he asked me, very quietly, about a laptop I'd mentioned in passing 2 months ago, whether I still had it, where I kept it. What did you tell him? That I'd sold it. Needed the money. A pause. He believed me, or he's pretending to believe me. I can't always tell with him. You need to leave his orbit entirely, today. I know. I have a sister in Philadelphia. I was going to... Don't tell me where, Charlotte said quickly. If I don't know, I can't be made to tell anyone. Silence on Olivia's end. Then, he has someone watching your building, the one in Midtown, your old sublease. I'm not there. I figured. But whoever it is has been there since yesterday morning. Nathan has a man named Garrett who handles his private security operations. Not the corporate team, the other one. The one that doesn't exist on paper. Garrett's people don't follow rules the way corporate security does. Charlotte wrote the name on the legal pad. Garrett. Have you seen him personally, Garrett? Once. At an event Nathan took me to in the Hamptons. He stood in the back the whole night and didn't talk to anyone, and Nathan looked at him exactly once, at the end of the evening, and something passed between them. I don't know what, just a look. And the next morning, Nathan told me that a business problem had been handled. I didn't ask what that meant. The words landed with a particular weight. Charlotte ended the call and went to find Damien. He was in the main room with Marcus and a 3rd man she hadn't been introduced to, all 3 of them around the kitchen counter with a city map open on a tablet. When Charlotte appeared, Damien looked up and read her face. Give us a minute, he said to Marcus. The 2 men moved to the far end of the room with the practiced discretion of people accustomed to conversations that weren't theirs. Nathan has a private security operation, Charlotte said. Off books. A man named Garrett runs it. He has someone watching my old apartment, and he may have others in play. She held Damien's eyes. Olivia said there's a name for what this team does. She said a business problem was handled. I need you to tell me honestly, given what Nathan has at stake, what does that mean? Damien didn't look away from her. It means he's moved from containment to elimination. He's not trying to discredit you anymore. He's trying to make you unavailable. The words sat between them. Okay, Charlotte said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which she noted as information about herself. Then we accelerate the timeline. Can the gala be moved up? I'll call Hartford. He called her. The gala could not be moved. It was a 300-person event with catering contracts and security coordination and guest logistics that couldn't be compressed without becoming chaotic, and chaos was the last thing they needed. Hartford's assistant relayed that Evelyn herself had personally reviewed the guest list and had taken certain steps to ensure the right people would be in the room, which told Charlotte that Damien had communicated more to Evelyn Hartford than he'd let on, and she filed that away without comment because right now the only currency that mattered was forward motion. They had 2 days. On the second of those days, at 11 in the morning, Charlotte's phone rang from a number she recognized. Daniel Marsh, senior partner at Whitmore and Cross's former joint firm, technically Nathan's firm now, the one from which Charlotte had been fired and her accounts frozen. She had worked under Marsh for 4 years before the marriage, before Nathan had maneuvered her into a lateral position that kept her inside the firm's orbit while limiting her access to the highest level accounts. Marsh had let it happen. She'd never fully forgiven him for it. And she'd never said so because she'd needed the employment and couldn't afford the dignity. She answered. Charlotte. Marsh's voice had the careful modulation of a man who had rehearsed the call. I know this is unexpected. It is. I want you to know that the fraud allegation, the one Nathan filed, I wasn't part of that. I didn't know the scope of it until the DA's office contacted the firm for documentation, and at that point I began looking more carefully at certain account structures that He paused. I should have looked at sooner. Yes, Charlotte said. You should have. A silence that he deserved to sit in. I have documentation here, in the firm's internal archives, records from 2018 and 2019 that I believe were altered after the fact. Original versions and the modified versions both present in the system because whoever made the changes didn't fully clear the revision history. I think Nathan's people assumed the archive system would auto-purge. It doesn't. It never has. Charlotte was very still. How comprehensive. The ownership transfer documents for the Whitmore Trust equity position. Both versions. The original, which names you as the sole beneficiary of the transferred stake, and the modified version, which shows the trust as having been dissolved prior to Richard's death with no surviving beneficiary. He paused. There's also a signature on the modification authorization that is not what it appears to be. You're saying it's forged. I'm saying it bears Nathan's authorization code, but the signature itself, on visual comparison to his known signature samples in our own records. Marsh stopped again. The careful language of a man building a legal buffer around himself while trying to do something close to the right thing. I'm saying it warrants examination. Daniel, Charlotte kept her voice measured. Why are you calling me and not the DA's office? Because the DA's office has a relationship with Nathan that I don't fully trust to be arm's length, and because the rehearsed quality dropped, just briefly, and what was underneath it was something older and more honest, the voice of a man who had made a compromised choice 4 years ago and had been living with the texture of it since, because your father was the best man I worked with in 30 years in this industry. And what Nathan did to his estate is something I should have seen and didn't because I was too careful about my own position to look at anyone else's. Charlotte absorbed this. She thought about her father, Richard Whitmore, who had buried evidence to protect a family he barely knew, who had tried to protect his own estate and failed, who had died with his house dismantled around him while his daughter was still inside the marriage that had done the dismantling. Email me the archive files, she said, encrypted. I'll send you a secure address. Already prepared. And Daniel, after this is over, I'm going to want to talk to you about what you knew in 2018 and what you chose not to act on, not for legal purposes, for my own understanding. A long pause. Fair, he said quietly. She ended the call, sent him the secure address, sat back. The archive files arrived 20 minutes later. She opened them. The original ownership document was exactly what Marsh had described. Clean, correctly structured, with Charlotte Whitmore listed as the sole surviving beneficiary of the Whitmore Family Trust equity stake, representing a 12.4% ownership position in the predecessor entity to Cross Capital Management. The document was dated 14 months before Richard Whitmore's death, properly witnessed and notarized. The modified version replaced Charlotte's name with a dissolved trust notation and altered the effective date to 11 months before Richard's last will and testament was filed. The modification also removed the notarization from the original witness, replacing it with a different notary stamp from an office in New Jersey that Charlotte immediately noted for follow-up. And then she saw the signature. She looked at it for a long time. The authorization signature on the modification document, the signature that bore Nathan Cross's authorization code. It was not Nathan's handwriting. She had spent 3 years studying Nathan Cross's physical signature, on checks, on contracts, on the back of the occasional card that arrived from his office without feeling. She knew its particular qualities, the overextended loop on the N, the way the C in Cross dropped below the baseline, the consistent 3mm gap between his first and last name. This signature had the gap. It had the dropped C. It had the overextended loop. But the pressure pattern was wrong. She could see it in the way the ink spread at the terminal strokes, too heavy, the pen held at an angle that was not Nathan's angle. Someone had studied his signature carefully, very carefully, practiced it until it was nearly perfect. Nearly. Charlotte set the document beside the original and looked at them both. Someone else had forged Nathan's authorization on the modification document, which meant Nathan had not personally executed the ownership transfer fraud, which meant there was a second actor in this architecture. Someone who had the access, the motive, and the capability to forge a billionaire's signature on a legal document and have it pass through a major law firm's archive system undetected for years. She was still looking at the two documents when her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. 3 words and a location. Garrett has Olivia. The address that followed was a building in Midtown South. Charlotte stood up so fast the chair caught the table edge and the laptop lurched. She grabbed it. Her hands were not steady now. Not the arrhythmia. Not the managed cardiac irregularity she knew how to breathe through. This was different. This was the older, rawer fear of a woman who had just understood that the threat had moved from herself to someone else. She went to the main room. Damien was already on the phone, standing with that stillness that she was beginning to read as the particular quality of a man shifting from one mode of operation into another. He ended the call when she appeared. "I know," he said. "We have to go now." Marcus is already there. He's maintaining distance. Garrett's people are armed and the building has limited egress points. Moving without a plan will make it worse. She called Nathan's people off a private server drive that can put him in a federal prison. He's not going to put... Charlotte stopped, breathed, put the words in order. He can't let her testify, Damien. "I know. Then what's the plan?" Damien looked at her with the expression of a man who was about to say something that he would rather not say, and Charlotte felt the particular quality of that pause, the weight of information withheld, the specific shape of a thing being managed. "What?" she said. "Victor Crane called me an hour ago," Damien said. "While you were working, he had information that he'd received through one of our legal contacts, a source inside the DA's office." Charlotte waited. The fraud allegation Nathan filed, the documentation he submitted to the DA. Damien's voice remained level, which was beginning to seem like a structural achievement rather than a natural condition. It was submitted with a supporting witness declaration, a signed statement corroborating the fraudulent transfer timeline and placing you as the primary executor. "Who signed it?" Charlotte said. The pause before his answer was the longest pause he had given her since she'd sat down on the pavement in Bryant Park. "Daniel Marsh," Damien said. The room didn't move. The city outside the windows continued its enormous, indifferent operation. Charlotte stood very still and felt the thing she'd just heard arrive in her body the way structural damage arrives, not all at once, but as a sequence of recognitions, each one confirming the previous, each one making the total more. The word completed itself in Charlotte's chest before it finished in the room. Marsh. Daniel Marsh, who had called her with the careful voice of a man performing contrition, who had walked her through the archive files with the measured precision of someone who had rehearsed which details to surface and which to withhold, who had told her your father was the best man I worked with in 30 years in a tone that had almost sounded like the truth. She had sent him a secure address. She thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. Then she crossed to the laptop, opened the secure email account, and checked whether the archive files Marsh had sent contained embedded tracking code. She wasn't a cybersecurity expert, but she knew what to look for in document metadata, and she found it in 40 seconds. A pixel tag embedded in the PDF header, the kind that pinged a server on document open and returned an IP address. She had opened those files 20 minutes ago. "He knows where I am," she said. Damien was already moving. He reached the door of the secondary room in 3 strides and said something to Marcus through it that Charlotte didn't catch, and Marcus was gone before she'd closed the laptop. "We have maybe 10 minutes before Garrett's people know the location," Damien said. He came back to her, not rushing, but covering distance with the economy of someone for whom urgency didn't require performance. "We need to move. Olivia first. Marcus is handling Olivia. Marcus is one person, and Garrett has at minimum 3 at that location. Marcus has backup, Charlotte." He said her name with a particular weight, not to silence her, but to make contact, to give her something to orient against. "Olivia will be out of that building in the next 8 minutes. I need you to trust that and focus on what comes next." She looked at him, at the quality of certainty in his face. Not arrogance, not performance, but the specific assurance of a man who had spent 20 years operating in conditions where misjudging his own resources was fatal. "Okay," she said. "The gala is tonight." She stared at him. "Tonight. Hartford moved it up. She called me 20 minutes ago. She'd received information through her own channels about Nathan's fraud filing and the DA contact. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly, that she had not spent 40 years building a financial network to watch it be used as cover for a man who forged a dead colleague's estate documents." Damien held Charlotte's gaze. "The room will be ready at 8. The guests who matter will be there. Hartford is personally vouching for the access you need." Charlotte looked at the laptop, at the legal pad covered in 7 days of accumulated evidence, at the flash drive still in the port. "Everything I have is here," she said. "The trust documents, Marsh's archive originals, the Reeves recording, the ownership chain, the modification forgery analysis. Copy it to 3 separate drives. One stays with me, one with my legal team, one you carry. If any single point of the chain is compromised, the other 2 survive." She was already moving. 3 drives from the supply case Marcus had brought 2 nights ago. She copied everything in parallel, hands moving with the muscle memory of years spent managing data under deadline pressure. Her heart was behaving. Her hands were steady. The fear was present, but it had been converted, refined into something more useful, something with direction and edge. Damien's phone buzzed. He read the screen. "Marcus has her. Olivia's out." Charlotte exhaled once, short and controlled. "Is she hurt?" "Shaken. Not physically." A pause as another message arrived. "Garrett's team had her for less than 2 hours. They were holding her as leverage, not processing her as a threat, which means Nathan wanted her available to use, not gone. He was going to bring her to me, offer to release her in exchange for the drive. That's my read. He doesn't know I already have the drive." "No. He thinks Olivia still has it and thinks you don't know about her." Damien pocketed the phone. "Which means we have a window before he recalculates." Charlotte pulled the 3rd drive from the port and held it in her closed fist for a moment. The weight of it, which was almost nothing, 4 ounces of plastic and memory against the full weight of what it contained. Her father's name, her father's signature buried under someone else's forgery. Her father's cardiologist's voice on a 14-second recording that she still hadn't let herself finish listening to. She put the drive in the inside pocket of her jacket and felt it settle against her ribs. "There's something I still don't have," she said. "The forgery on the modification document, the signature that isn't Nathan's. Someone else executed that piece of the fraud. Someone with access to the original documents, to Nathan's signature samples, to the notarization infrastructure in New Jersey." She looked at Damien. "I need to know who that is before tonight, because if that person is in that room and I don't know their face, they're a variable I can't control." Damien was quiet for a moment. The particular quality of that silence was one Charlotte had started to be able to distinguish from his other silences. This one had weight in it, the specific gravity of information being decided on. "I have a name," he said. "I've had it since yesterday. I was waiting for confirmation before I brought it to you. Tell me." "Samuel Carter." She processed this. "The man you mentioned, my father's closest friend, who also, as of 2016, had been quietly retained as a private legal consultant by Cross Capital Management under a different professional identity. Damien's voice was flat and careful. Carter introduced your father to Nathan Cross in 2017. He facilitated the introduction that led to the marriage. The sequence assembled itself in Charlotte's mind with the horrible clarity of something that had always been true and simply unexamined. The introduction, the marriage, the slow dismantling of her financial independence, the fraud allegation timed perfectly to preempt her questions. Carter, who had known her father for 30 years, who had been at the funeral, who had access to every document Richard Whitmore had ever filed. He's the one who forged Nathan's signature, she said. We believe he executed the modification document using Nathan's authorization code and forged the physical signature as backup verification in case the code was ever challenged. He had legal expertise, access to Nathan's corporate signature samples through the consulting relationship, and a notarization contact in New Jersey who's been on Nathan's payroll since 2015. Why? Not what she wanted to ask. What she wanted to ask was more specific and more devastated than that single word could carry. But it was the one she had. Money. Carter's practice had been insolvent since 2014. Nathan paid off his debts, funded his retirement, and gave him a consulting income that required no visible work. In return, Carter provided access to your father's trust, his estate documents, and 30 years of accumulated legal history. Damien paused. He also, we believe, provided Nathan with the information about my connection to your family. Carter knew about the 2009 debt. He knew I'd been looking for you. He fed Nathan the intelligence that let him intercept every attempt I made to reach you. Charlotte stood in the middle of the room with that in her body. Samuel Carter, who had told her at her father's funeral, with tears that she had believed were genuine because she had believed in the 30-year friendship that produced them, that Richard had been so proud of her, who had handed her a handkerchief, who had said, "Call me if you need anything, Charlotte. I mean that. Your father meant the world to me." "Is he going to be at the gala tonight?" she said. "He was on the original guest list. Hartford's assistant confirmed this morning that his seat has been reserved." "Good," Charlotte said. Her voice was very quiet. Not the quiet of someone suppressing emotion, the quiet of someone who has moved through the emotion into the territory on the other side of it, where the terrain is harder and clearer and the footing is entirely different. "Good," she said again. They moved out of the building at 4 p.m. through a service exit that led onto a side street where a car was already waiting. Charlotte had 4 hours. She spent 90 minutes of them in a room off the hotel corridor that Damien's team had secured, going through the evidence one final time with his senior attorney, a woman named Park, who had the rapid, surgical intelligence of someone who had argued high-stakes cases in front of people who were trying to destroy her and had found it motivating rather than discouraging. Park went through the documentation without comment for 40 minutes, and then looked up and said, "This is solid. The trust modification forgery alone is enough for criminal charges. The Reeves connection is going to be the part that generates headlines." "That's intentional," Charlotte said. "You understand that once that recording goes public, there will be civil suits, criminal investigations, and a media cycle that will attach itself to your name for the next 3 to 5 years, regardless of the outcome." "I understand. And you're prepared for that." Charlotte looked at her. "My father managed to protect a family he barely knew from people trying to destroy them, at significant personal cost without asking for anything back. He did it quietly and completely. The least I can do is finish what he started." Park held her gaze for a moment, then she went back to the documents. At 7:45, Charlotte stood in the bathroom of the secured room and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Damien had arranged clothes. She hadn't asked how or when, but they had appeared, which she was beginning to understand was simply how things worked in his orbit. A dark dress, structured rather than ornamental, the kind of thing that conveyed presence without performing it. She had put it on and stood at the mirror and thought about the woman who had signed divorce papers in a courthouse hallway 6 days ago with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. The hand in the mirror was steady. She pressed her fingers against her ribs. Her heart was there, present, measured, doing what it was supposed to do. She picked up the flash drive from the bathroom counter and put it back in her pocket. In the main room, Damien was waiting. He'd changed into a darker suit, still the same quality, still the same understated authority, but with a precision to it that said, "Tonight is different." He looked at her when she came in, and the look lasted a moment longer than a functional assessment required. Ready? He said. Yes. They went down to the car. The Plaza Hotel at 8 p.m. on the night of the Hartford Gala was a particular kind of organized spectacle. 300 of New York's financial establishment gathered in the grand ballroom under chandeliers that had been casting light on the city's money for over a century. Charlotte had been to events like this before, in the years when Nathan had required her presence as a professional accessory, and she remembered the specific social physics of them, the way every conversation was simultaneously about itself and about something else, the way alliances and hostilities expressed themselves in seating proximity and eye contact duration. She entered beside Damian Blackwood. She felt the room change the moment they crossed the threshold. Not dramatically, not the movie version of a crowd going silent. More subtle than that, a ripple, an adjustment. The way a room of people who are experienced at reading power register the arrival of something significant and recalibrate without interrupting the surface of their own conversations. She kept her spine straight and her pace even, and she looked at the room rather than at the floor, which was a decision she had made in the car and which cost her something to maintain. Nathan was across the ballroom. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing with two board members she recognized, a glass in his hand, wearing the expression of a man who believed the evening was his. He had the particular ease of someone who had arranged the furniture of the situation to his advantage and was waiting for the performance to confirm it. Then he turned and saw her. The ease lasted approximately 1 second after the visual recognition. Then something moved through his face. Not fear, not yet, but the specific recalibration of a man who had made a calculation and discovered a variable he'd missed. His eyes went to Damian, to the quality of their entrance, to the way the room had adjusted. Charlotte held his gaze across the ballroom for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned away. Evelyn Hartford found them within 5 minutes, a woman in her late 60s with the composed authority of someone who had spent 4 decades making rooms like this work for her. She took Charlotte's hands in both of hers and said without preamble, "Your father would have been furious that it came to this. He always preferred the clean resolution." She looked at Charlotte with the directness of an elder who has earned the right to it. "Let's make sure it's clean." She guided them to a table near the front where 3 people were already seated. A federal financial crimes investigator Charlotte had identified 2 days ago as someone with an active interest in cross-capital, a journalist from the Times financial desk whose reputation for source protection was considered inviolable, and an elderly man with careful eyes and a stillness that Charlotte recognized before Hartford said his name. "Samuel Carter," Hartford said. Carter looked up and saw Charlotte. He was good. She hadn't to give him that. The shock lasted less than a second, the eyes widening fractionally, the hands on the table going still, a brief arrest in his breathing that she caught because she was watching for it. Then the mask came back down, and what replaced the shock was something she recognized as the performance of warmth. The same warmth he'd deployed at the funeral, the same warmth that had delivered her directly into the arms of the man who had destroyed her family. "Charlotte," he said. He started to stand. "Sit down, Samuel," she said quietly. He sat. She put her hand on the back of the chair across from him and looked at him with the full weight of what she now knew. Not performing the knowledge, not weaponizing it prematurely, just letting him see that she had it, that the accounting was complete, that there was no version of this evening in which he walked out of this room as the man who had walked in. Carter's hands on the table were very still. "We should talk," he said. His voice had the compressed quality of someone managing a situation they've lost control of while pretending they haven't. "We will," Charlotte said, "in about 20 minutes, in front of everyone in this room." She straightened, moved to her seat. The drive was in her pocket. The evidence was in 3 separate locations. Park was at a table near the east wall with the legal documentation ready. Damian stood 2 steps behind Charlotte, and the room around him was giving him exactly the radius it always gave him. Not wide enough to be theatrical, just the natural distance that accumulated around a man whose reputation occupied space before he did. Nathan was moving through the crowd now. She could see him from the corner of her eye. The controlled pace of someone trying not to look like they were crossing a room with urgency. He had his phone to his ear. Garrett, probably. Recalculating. Then from the west entrance, 2 things happened simultaneously. Marsh came through the door. Daniel Marsh, who had betrayed her and then betrayed Nathan and then betrayed her again, with the look of a man who had fully understood the mathematics of his own situation and found them intolerable. He was accompanied by a woman Charlotte didn't recognize, and the woman had a badge. Federal Financial Crimes. Nathan saw Marsh, saw the badge. Something in his composure, the careful architecture of a man who had spent 20 years building the presentation of himself, developed the first visible crack. He turned and found Charlotte looking directly at him, 20 feet of polished ballroom floor between them. 300 people around them who were beginning, with the exquisite sensitivity of people trained to read rooms, to understand that something was happening that was not on the evening's program. Nathan took a step toward her. Damien moved. Not dramatically, not in the way that movies stage these things. No raised voices, no posturing. He simply stepped to Charlotte's side and stood there. And the quality of that standing was such that Nathan stopped mid-stride with the sudden understanding of a man who has just walked to the edge of something and looked down. "Charlotte," Nathan said. His voice was very controlled. It was the voice she had heard for 3 years when he was angry and didn't want anyone to know he was angry. "Whatever you think you have, I know about the trust modification," she said. "I know about Reeves. I know about Carter." She paused. "I know about the server, Nathan." His jaw moved. "The DA's contact," she said. "The one you've been cultivating for 6 years. His name is going to be in my documentation as well, because Olivia's recordings covered more conversations than you realized she'd copied." A beat. "She's safe, by the way. Your man Garrett is going to want a lawyer." Nathan's face had passed through the controlled anger and arrived somewhere colder. "You have no idea what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing." She held his gaze. "I'm finishing something my father started." She turned toward the stage, and Nathan, who had spent 20 years making sure he was always the person who determined what happened next, reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was hard, and it was wrong, and it landed on Charlotte's wrist like a closing trap, and the room, the 300 people and the chandeliers and the century of accumulated money, seemed to inhale all at once. Damien had Nathan's wrist in his hand before the room exhaled. He didn't twist it. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held it with a pressure that was precise and total. And he looked at Nathan Cross with the expression of a man who has arrived at the end of a very long patience and found it exactly as he expected. "Let go," Damien said. The words were quiet enough that only the 3 of them heard them. And Nathan Cross, whose corporate empire had made him untouchable, whose legal infrastructure had made him bulletproof, whose money had made him larger than the rules that governed smaller men, let go. He stepped back. His face was white. From the west entrance, 3 more federal agents had come through the door. From the east, Park was standing with the documentation file open, speaking to the Times journalist in the low, rapid register of someone delivering verified facts. Samuel Carter had not moved from his chair. Charlotte straightened her wrist, felt the ache in it. Nathan's grip had been hard enough to leave a mark, which she noted and set aside. She looked at the stage, the microphone, the room full of people now fully alert, the particular charged silence of 300 people who understood they were about to witness something. She walked to the stage. The distance was maybe 40 feet, and it took her past tables of people who had stopped their conversations and turned in their chairs, past waitstaff who had gone still with the particular animal sensitivity of people who understood the temperature of a room had changed without knowing why. Past the Times journalist who was already recording on a handheld device with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned years ago that the moment you announce yourself, the moment ends. Her wrist ached where Nathan had grabbed it. She didn't touch it. The steps to the stage were 3 low risers. She took them one at a time, not because she was being ceremonial, but because her heart was doing the thing it did under significant stress. Not the arrhythmia, not the structural failure she'd been managing since her 20s, but the simpler, older response of a body that understood it was at the edge of something irreversible and wanted the record to show it had registered the weight of the decision. She breathed through it. In 4, hold 4, out 6. By the time she reached the microphone, the rhythm had settled. The ballroom was very quiet. 300 people. The accumulated financial and social gravity of the East Coast establishment gathered under crystal light, in a room that had hosted a century of deals and revelations and the particular theater of money expressing itself. They were all looking at her. She felt the weight of it, not as pressure to perform, but as a kind of obligation, the seriousness of a room full of witnesses who didn't yet know what they were witnessing. She took the microphone off its stand. "My name is Charlotte Whitmore," she said. "My father was Richard Whitmore. Most of you in this room knew him. Some of you did business with him for decades. All of you knew him to be a man whose word was worth more than the paper his contracts were printed on. She paused. Let it sit. 8 years ago, a man named Nathan Cross began systematically dismantling everything my father built, using tools my father had provided him in good faith. His name, his financial relationships, and the equity stake he had accumulated over 30 years of honest work. She looked out at the room, at the faces, some already understanding, some still assembling the picture, all of them alert in the specific way of people who are being told something they will not be able to unknow. He did this by marrying me, by using our marriage to access my father's estate documents, to alter legal records, and to manufacture a fraudulent ownership transfer that erased my inheritance and capitalized his company with stolen assets. Somewhere in the room, a woman's voice said something low that Charlotte couldn't hear. Nobody responded to it. I have documentation of all of it. The original trust documents and the modified versions, both preserved in the firm's archive, where the revision history was never purged. Audio recordings from a private server, financial records establishing the full chain of ownership transfer, and a forensic analysis of the modification document that establishes, beyond reasonable question, that the authorization signature was forged. She reached into her pocket and held up the flash drive. Not theatrical, just visible. The physical proof that the thing she was describing existed. The federal agents currently in this room have copies of everything I've described. So does the attorney at the table by the east wall. So does this journalist. She nodded toward the Times desk. 3 separate chains of custody, because the man who built this fraud has spent 20 years cultivating relationships inside the institutions designed to stop people like him, and I wanted to make sure that none of those relationships could make this disappear. She looked across the ballroom. Nathan was near the west wall, and the 2 federal agents who had been moving through the room for the past 4 minutes were now standing within 10 feet of him. He was not looking at the agents. He was looking at Charlotte, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen there in 3 years of marriage. Not the controlled anger, not the performative warmth, not the careful construction of a man who always knew what face he needed. This was something underneath all of that, something raw and disorganized. The face of a man watching his entire architecture come down and being unable to find the right response because he had never built one for this specific scenario. He had never built one because he had never believed she was capable of this. That had been his fundamental error, and it was not an error of intelligence. It was an error of contempt. He had looked at Charlotte Whitmore and seen a woman he could reduce, and he had confused the reduction with the truth of her. Nathan Cross will be arrested tonight, she said. His board has been notified. His company's assets are frozen pending federal review. She paused. Samuel Carter, who served as the legal architect of the ownership fraud and who forged the authorization documents, is sitting at the table in the center of this room. He is also being detained. A beat. And Dr. Gerald Reeves, the cardiologist who managed my father's decline in exchange for financial compensation from Cross Capital Management, has been referred to both the federal investigation and the state medical board. The room had gone to an almost physical silence, the kind that has texture and mass, the silence of people processing information that is reorganizing something in them. Charlotte set the microphone back on the stand. My father never told me what he did in 2009, she said. Her voice was quieter now. Not for effect, but because the next part had no performance in it, and the absence of performance required a different register. He buried evidence that would have destroyed a family he barely knew, because he believed some debts were worth more than the profit you could take from them. He spent the rest of his life paying for that choice, and never once suggested he'd made the wrong one. She looked at the microphone stand for a moment. I'm done speaking, she said. She stepped off the stage. What followed was not clean. She had known it wouldn't be, but knowing and experiencing are different countries. The federal agents moved on Nathan before Charlotte had fully cleared the stage steps, and Nathan did not go quietly. Not violently, but with the extended, furious negotiation of a man whose entire identity was organized around the belief that the right conversation, with the right person, in the right tone, could always alter the outcome. She heard his voice from across the ballroom as the agents flanked him, still modulated, still attempting the cadence of control, still trying to find the version of this where he was managing the situation rather than inside it. One of the agents said something short and definitive. Nathan stopped talking, He was escorted out through the west entrance with his hands behind his back, and Charlotte stood near the base of the stage and watched it happen without moving. She had imagined this moment in various forms over the past 4 days, and in none of the versions had she felt what she actually felt, which was not triumph and not relief, but something more complex and less satisfying. The specific weight of a thing that has cost more than it was worth and is necessary anyway. Her father was still dead. Reeves's recordings would confirm what she already knew in her body, but could not yet fully hold in her conscious mind, and that knowledge would require its own time and its own process. The money, the equity, the inheritance, those could be restored in the legal sense, the way a demolished building can be rebuilt on its original foundation. What couldn't be restored was the 7 years she hadn't known, the 3 years inside the marriage. The specific grief of realizing the man her father had trusted with her future had been the instrument of his decline. That math didn't balance. It never would. Evelyn Hartford appeared at her side with 2 glasses of water, not champagne, which Charlotte registered as an act of precise social intelligence. She handed one to Charlotte without a word, and they stood together for a moment watching the room reassemble itself around the new information it contained. "Your father would have hated the spectacle," Hartford said. "He would have understood why it was necessary," Charlotte said. "Yes." Hartford drank her water. He usually did. Across the room, Samuel Carter was being spoken to by Park and one of the federal agents. Carter was sitting very still, the stillness of a man who has run out of moves and has moved past the stage of pretending he hasn't. He was looking at the table in front of him with an expression Charlotte could see from 40 feet away. And the expression was not the performance of anything. It was simply the face of a man confronting the full dimensions of what he had done and finding them larger than he'd kept them in his own accounting. She crossed the room to him. Park saw her coming and stepped back fractionally, giving Charlotte the space, understanding without being told that this was not her conversation. Carter looked up when she reached the table. He looked old. He had always seemed old to her. The good, authoritative old of a man with decades of competence, visible in his posture and his handling of rooms. But the competence was gone now, and what was left was simply age, and the particular diminishment of a person from whom the architecture of self-deception has been removed. Charlotte sat down across from him. She sat there for a moment without speaking, looking at the man who had handed her a handkerchief at her father's funeral and told her Richard was proud of her. She thought about whether she'd believed it at the time. She had. She'd held on to that. The idea that her father, in the last years when she'd been so consumed by the marriage and its slow erosion that she'd barely been present for him, had still thought about her future with something like pride. Carter had known that would land. He delivered it with the precision of a man who understood which stories people needed to hear. "I want to know one thing," Charlotte said. Carter's hands on the table were perfectly still. "Charlotte, one thing. The rest can be for the lawyers." She held his eyes. "Did you believe he'd recover?" "My father. When you were managing his care through Reeves, running his medication adjustments through Nathan's direction, did you tell yourself he might still recover, or did you know what you were doing?" The silence was long enough that it became its own answer. "I told myself it was just management," Carter said finally. His voice was very low. "That we were managing the timeline, not accelerating anything, that Richard was already declining, that Reeves was just—" He stopped. "Just what?" "Making sure the trajectory didn't change." He looked at the table. "I told myself that. And you believed it." He didn't answer. "No," Charlotte said. "You didn't believe it. You just needed the story." She looked at him, not with hatred, because what she felt was actually too large and too depleted for something as focused as hatred. It was more like the exhausted reckoning of a person completing a very long inventory. "You knew my father for 30 years. You knew what he was." Carter's jaw worked. "You knew," Charlotte said again quietly, "and you did it anyway, because Nathan had something you needed more than you needed to be the person my father thought you were." She stood up. Carter said nothing. There was nothing to say that would function as anything other than a further exposure, and he seemed to understand that. "I hope the money was enough," Charlotte said, "because it's the only thing you're going to have left." She walked away from the table. Damien was near the ballroom entrance speaking with the lead federal agent, a quiet, direct conversation that concluded with the agent nodding once and moving off. Damien turned when Charlotte approached and looked at her face with the same reading attention she had been on the receiving end of since Bryant Park. The look that took in more than surface information and processed it without announcement. "Carter," he said. "Handled." She stopped beside him and looked at the room. The ongoing conversations, the agents at the periphery, the dissolution of Nathan Cross's empire occurring in real time in the spaces between the dinner tables. "It's done." "Almost," Damien said. She looked at him. "There's someone here who asked to speak with you. He's been waiting for 3 hours. He arrived before the gala started, which tells you something about how much he wanted to make sure he got here." Damien nodded toward a small anteroom off the main entrance, where a man was visible through the half-open door. Elderly, seated, with the careful patience of someone accustomed to waiting for things that mattered. Charlotte didn't recognize him immediately. Then she did. Arthur Wynne, her father's first employer 40 years ago. She had met him twice as a child, once at a firm anniversary event she had attended in a dress that was too formal for a 7-year-old, and once at a dinner at their house in Connecticut, where the adults had talked all evening about things she hadn't understood, and she'd been allowed to stay up past her bedtime because her father was in a good mood. Wynne had given her a book. She couldn't remember what book. She remembered the quality of his attention, the way he'd spoken to her as though her responses were worth waiting for, which was not how most adults spoke to 7-year-olds. She went into the anteroom. Wynne looked up. He was in his late 80s now, the kind of late 80s that announced themselves in the slowness of movement and the increased economy of gesture, everything pared down to what was essential. But his eyes were the same as she remembered, the particular clear gray of someone for whom paying attention had always been the primary tool. "Charlotte Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Wynne." "Sit down, please. I'm going to need you to sit down because what I have to tell you is going to take a few minutes and my neck is getting too old to look up for long." She sat. Wynne reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. Standard size, sealed, with no markings on the outside. He held it, but didn't give it to her yet. "Your father came to see me in the last month of his life," he said. "He didn't tell me he was dying, that I don't think he knew the full scope of it, or if he did, he was characteristically not making an event of it. He told me he had a situation he hadn't been able to resolve, and that he was running out of time to resolve it." "Masum Trinity." Wynne's hands on the envelope were steady. "He gave me this and asked me to hold it. He said, if Charlotte ever comes to understand what happened, give her this. If she never comes to understand, burn it." Charlotte looked at the envelope. "I've been watching," Wynne said. "Tonight is the answer to the condition he set." He held the envelope out. She took it. The seal opened cleanly. Her father had always used a single strip of tape rather than the gummed flap, a small habit she hadn't thought about in years, and which arrived now with the full physical weight of someone long absent. Inside was a single page handwritten in her father's particular script. The forward lean, the careful spacing, the way he made his lowercase e's with a single deliberate stroke. She read it. It was not long. Richard Whitmore had not been a man who used more words than the thought required. He had written, "I know what Nathan is. I found out too late to stop the damage without pulling you into the fight before you were ready. I tried to protect the documents. I wasn't fast enough. But I trust you, Charlotte, more than you have ever trusted yourself, which has always been the only gap between who you are and who you're capable of being. By the time you read this, you will have already done everything that needs doing. I know that because I know you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to see it. I would have liked to see it. Finish it clean. Love, Dad." Charlotte sat in the anteroom and read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and held the envelope in both hands in her lap. She did not cry. Not because she was suppressing it. There was no suppression involved, no effort required. She simply sat in the full weight of it and let it be what it was. Her father's voice, arriving 7 years late, telling her what he had always believed and what it had taken her the entirety of the intervening time to become. Wynne let her have the silence. After a while, she said, "He knew Carter would betray him." "I believe so," Wynne said. "He didn't say it directly, but he asked me to keep the letter from Carter specifically, which is not something you specify about a man you trust. He protected Carter anyway, didn't expose him. Richard was constitutionally incapable of taking a small revenge. It wasn't how he was built." Wynne paused. "He wanted you to do it properly, in a room full of people, with evidence that couldn't be refuted. He just didn't want to presume you'd want to." Charlotte looked at the envelope in her hands. "He always said he trusted me more than I trusted myself." He said that to me as well, more than once. Wynn's voice was old and dry and entirely without sentimentality, which made it carry more weight than if it had been tender. He wasn't wrong. She stayed in the anteroom for another few minutes, and Wynn stayed with her without requiring her to be anything other than what she was. A woman at the end of a very long thing, sitting in the quiet that the end of a very long thing produces. Then she stood, thanked him, put the letter in her pocket beside the flash drive, and went back out. The ballroom had shifted in register. The gala's formal program was abandoned, replaced by the ongoing conversations of people processing what they'd witnessed and beginning the social and financial calculations that would follow. Nathan's board members were clustered near the east wall in the tight, urgent formation of people managing a crisis. The Times journalist was in a corner with her phone to her ear. Park was speaking with two of the federal agents with the systematic efficiency of someone transferring a case from informal presentation to formal legal process. Olivia Parker was standing near the entrance. Charlotte hadn't known she'd come. Olivia was in clothes that were slightly wrong for the room. Good clothes, but not the specific register of the event, the look of someone who had arrived quickly from somewhere else and hadn't had time to adjust. Her face was drawn, and her eyes had the particular quality of someone who had spent several hours being frightened and had come out the other side into a kind of exhausted relief that hadn't yet been confirmed as permanent. Charlotte went to her. Olivia looked at her with an expression that was trying to be something composed and not quite achieving it. "I know I wasn't supposed to come," she said. "Marcus told me to stay." "It's fine," Charlotte said. "I just needed to see it. I needed to see if it actually—" Olivia stopped, looked past Charlotte at the room, at the visible absence where Nathan's presence had been, at the agents and the lawyers and the 300 witnesses. Something moved through her face. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of relief, the first fractional release of a tension that had been structural for long enough that its absence was disorienting. "It happened," Charlotte said. Olivia looked at her. "Is it enough? Is it enough to keep you safe?" "Yes." Charlotte said it with the flat certainty of a woman who had spent 6 days building something airtight precisely so this answer could be given. "You'll need to speak to the federal investigators. They'll protect your testimony, but yes, it's enough." Olivia's face did something complicated that ended in a single long exhale, the specific exhale of someone setting down a weight they've been carrying for so long they'd forgotten what their own shoulders felt like. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay." Charlotte left her with Park, who would shepherd her through the federal contact with the competence and precision that characterized everything Park did, and crossed the ballroom to where Damien was standing near the windows. The same windows that faced downtown, the same direction as the view from the penthouse, the city laid out in its enormous nighttime indifference below. He turned when she came up beside him. He looked at her face with the reading attention she had come to rely on without intending to, and he didn't ask how she was. He had learned early, she thought, that asking that question was a form of making someone perform an answer, and he was not interested in her performance. "Carter is in federal custody," he said. "Reeves was picked up at his apartment an hour ago. My team had people there as a precaution. The New Jersey notary has already entered a cooperation agreement." "And Marsh?" "Marsh brought the archive files voluntarily and is cooperating fully. His attorney has been in contact with the DA's office since 6 p.m. A pause. "He's not a good man, but he made one right call at the end. People usually have exactly one," Charlotte said. She looked out at the city. "It's just a question of when they make it and whether it's enough." Damien was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Board of Cross Capital is convening an emergency session tomorrow. They've already received the documentation package. There will be a formal vote to remove Nathan from all positions and begin divestiture proceedings." He paused. "The equity stake, the original Whitmore position, will be part of the asset review. Your attorneys can begin the reclamation process as early as next week." Charlotte heard this and let it arrive. 12.4% of a company her father had helped build with 30 years of careful, honest work. Money was the smallest part of what it represented. What it represented was the plain, stubborn fact of her father's presence in the world, the trace he'd left. The record that he'd been here and had worked and had made something that was supposed to outlast him, and had, though not in the form anyone had intended. "I've been offered a position," she said. Damien looked at her. "The board contacted Park this afternoon, before the gala, before any of this was public. They want a director of corporate ethics, someone to build a compliance and oversight structure from the inside. She let out a short breath. I think they assumed I'd want the equity and nothing else. I don't think they expected me to consider the job. Are you considering it? I've been thinking about it since Park told me. She looked at the city. Nathan built that company on my father's money. The people who work there, the analysts, the junior staff, the people who had nothing to do with what Nathan did, they're not responsible for the foundation it was built on. They just need it to be run differently. A pause. My father spent his life doing things that needed doing without asking for recognition. It seems like the kind of thing he'd understand. Damien said nothing. He was listening in the way he listened, fully, without preparing a response while she was still talking. I'm going to take it, she said. Okay. That's all you have. It's your decision. I have an opinion if you want it. She looked at him. I want it. I think you'll be extraordinary at it, he said, and I think it will cost you something real. Both of those things are true at the same time. She held his gaze. You could have led with extraordinary. You wouldn't have believed it if I'd led with it. That was accurate enough that she didn't argue with it. The weeks that followed were not gentle. She had prepared herself for the legal process. The depositions, the asset review, the extended administrative machinery of a federal investigation that moved on its own timeline and acknowledged no one's emotional readiness. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the way time worked in the aftermath of something like this. The way ordinary mornings arrived with the insistence of ordinary mornings regardless of what had happened. The way you had to relearn the shape of a day that wasn't organized around the specific gravity of a fight. She learned it the way you learn things that have no instruction manual, imperfectly, slowly, by doing it and failing and doing it again. The Reeves recordings were formally submitted to the federal investigation in the third week. She didn't attend the submission. She gave her statement in a federal conference room with Park beside her and an investigator across the table who asked careful questions and wrote down her answers with the neutral professionalism of someone who had processed a great deal of human damage and understood that the processing was necessary work. When it was over, Charlotte sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes before she drove anywhere, just sitting with her hands on the steering wheel and her heart doing its usual managed behavior and the city outside going about its enormous ordinary business. Her father had known what Nathan was. He had known, and he'd tried to protect her, and he hadn't been fast enough, and he died carrying the weight of that. She would spend a long time with that fact, not resolving it, because it wasn't the kind of thing that resolved, but finding a way to carry it that didn't compromise her posture. She thought she could do that. She thought he would have expected her to. Nathan Cross entered a federal detention facility on a Tuesday morning in November, charged with financial fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, evidence tampering, and a secondary charge related to the management of her father's medical care that the prosecutors had constructed carefully from the Reeves recordings and the pharmaceutical subsidiary documentation. His attorney issued a statement that used the words complex and mischaracterized and context-dependent, which were the words attorneys used when the evidence was too comprehensive to deny and too clear to reframe. Charlotte read the statement once, set it down, and went to work. Samuel Carter pled guilty in December to 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of accessory to financial conspiracy. He received a sentence that his attorney called lenient and that Charlotte thought was probably accurate, which she noted without particular emotion. He was old. He would serve what he served and spend the rest of whatever remained in the reduced circumstances of a man who had traded his reputation for a comfort that no longer existed. She did not attend the sentencing. Gerald Reeves surrendered his medical license in November, 2 days before the formal revocation hearing. He did not contest the federal charges related to the pharmaceutical payments. Charlotte heard about this through Park, in a brief phone call, in the same week that the first papers on the equity reclamation were formally filed. Olivia Parker left New York in October, before the federal process was fully underway. Charlotte received a text from a Philadelphia area code. No name, just, I'm okay, starting over. Thank you. She saved the number and sent back, good, that's enough. Spring came the way spring always came to Manhattan, slowly, and then with conviction. The trees in Bryant Park coming out in early April, with the particular urgency of things that have been waiting a long time. Charlotte walked through the park on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th month of her new position. The job was hard in the way she'd expected. The resistance of institutional culture, the specific friction of building compliance structures inside an organization whose previous leadership had treated ethics as an inconvenience. It was exactly the kind of work that produced no applause and required significant patience and had results that were largely invisible until the moment they weren't. She liked it. She liked it the way her father had liked his work, not because it was easy or visible, but because it mattered and she was capable of it. And those two things together were enough. She sat down on a bench near the fountain. It was the same bench, or near enough. The pigeons were working the pavement with the same committed indifference. The lunch crowd moved at its usual pace. The city continued its enormous, sustained indifference to individual experience, which Charlotte had decided was not a failing of the city, but a kind of gift. The freedom of being a single person inside something large enough that your worst days were not its problem. Her phone buzzed. Damien. She had not resolved what Damien was in her life, and she had decided provisionally that not resolving it was acceptable. He called when something required his attention, and sometimes when nothing did. He had shown up at her apartment in March with coffee that was the right temperature and the information that the last outstanding asset from the Whitmore Trust reclamation had been formally transferred, and they had stood at her window looking at the city and talking about her father, and then about something entirely else. And she had understood that this was a person who was going to be in her life in a form that she didn't have an existing category for, and that creating a category was not currently necessary. She answered, "The equity transfer finalized this morning," he said. "Park has the documentation." "I know. She called an hour ago." "How does it feel?" She looked at the park, at the bench she was sitting on, which was ordinary wood and metal, which had absorbed 100,000 ordinary afternoons, and one that had been the turning point of her life. She thought about sitting on this bench in October with $43 in her wallet, and no house, and no job, and her heart misbehaving, and the specific desolation of a person who has just understood the full dimensions of what's been taken from them. Like something that needed to happen, she said, not like something that fixes it. "No," Damien said, "it wouldn't. My father left me a letter." She hadn't told him about this yet. She'd been carrying it for months, reading it occasionally the way you read certain things, not for new information but for the quality of the voice. He wrote it the month before he died. He said that by the time I read it, I would have already done everything that needed doing. A pause on Damien's end. "He was right," she said. "He knew you." "He did." She looked at the fountain, the water going up and coming down, the light doing what light does when it has water to work with, better than I knew myself for a long time. "And now?" She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "Getting there," she said. She could hear, in the quality of the silence on his end, the particular quality of a man who is listening with everything he had and not performing anything about it. She had come to understand this as a rare quality, the capacity to be present without requiring acknowledgement of the presence. Her father had had it. She was still working on it. She suspected it was the kind of thing you developed over a long time and lost occasionally and developed again, and that the development was the point rather than the arrival. "I'm going to be late tonight," she said. "There's a compliance review that's going to run past 7. "I'll have food at 8, Damien said, "if you want." "I want," she said. She ended the call, put her phone in her pocket, alongside the envelope that she still carried every day. Her father's letter in her father's handwriting, folded along its original creases, the paper beginning to soften slightly at the folds from the months of handling. She'd have it preserved properly at some point. For now, she kept it the way it was. Close, worn, real. She sat in Bryant Park for another 5 minutes and let the afternoon do what afternoons do. Proceed, indifferently, toward evening. The sun was moving west. The shadows of the buildings were getting long. The pigeons continued their committed and entirely unsentimental negotiation with the pavement. Charlotte Whitmore stood up. She straightened Mrs. Delgado's coat. She'd kept it, returned it laundered and pressed, and then Mrs. Delgado had given it back and told her to keep it because it looked better on Charlotte anyway, which was not true, but was the kind of gift that wasn't really about the coat. She straightened it and looked west, at the direction of the city she had lived in for 10 years, and was only now, she thought, beginning to actually inhabit. Then she walked forward into the rest of it.